We've seen how to understand errors when they arise, and we've seen how logging works. But sometimes the problems that we need to solve in programming aren't actual errors, and they don't show up in the logs. Usually these problems take the form of something like, well, what I expected to happen was X, but instead what happened was Y. It happens all the time. In this movie, let's talk about ways to debug your code and work through these problems. The first is just good common sense advice, but it's definitely the best debugging tool there is. Try and break problems down into smaller pieces. If a multi-step process isn't working, try and figure out which step is actually giving you the problem. If steps A, B, C, and D are breaking, first test A. Is that working the way it ought to? Are you getting the results you expect? Then add in B and test that. That'll help isolate the problem and help you develop faster. One great way to be able to step through your code piece by piece is using the Rails console. If you have a series of lines of code, you can enter one of them into the console and see what results you get. Then you can try and enter the next one. Because the Rails console gives you good output and also lets you stop and poke and prod an object, I often feel like it's like holding an object in your hand and examining it up close. Another great way to expose what's happening is using the inspect method. This is a Ruby method. We can call on any object. We can say object.inspect, so we can put it in our view and we can inspect there, or if you want to log it to a log file. Rails gives us a nice helper method to deal with Ruby's inspect, which is the debug helper, and that wraps the inspection inside some nice HTML tags for display in the view. So if I'm really stuck and don't understand why an object is the way it is, at the very bottom of my view, I'll just drop a line and say debug that object. And when I load the view the next time, I'll be able to see what's happening internally with that object. Another great way to expose what's going on inside your code is to use puts in the code, and that will output whatever you put to the server console. That's where it'll show up. It won't show up in the view. It shows up in the server console. So for example, we could say puts got here, and that'll let us know that we got to a certain point in our code. Or we can actually do that inspection. Puts at subjects.inspection will show us what subjects looks like in our console and not inside our view. There's one other tool for developing that some developers use called Ruby Debug. What Ruby Debug does is it lets you specify a point in the code that you want to pause and yield control to the command line, so that then from that server console, you can poke and prod at things. It's fairly similar to what you're doing with the Rails console, but you're just doing it actually as the server is running. Now, we won't cover it here because it's a whole topic itself and it has its own syntax, but I will say that I've never needed it, and I suspect that the folks who like it are the ones who've been used to having debuggers and breakpoint tools in other languages. So if that's you, you might want to take the time to learn more about it. But for me, I found that having these other tools at my disposal was adequate.